If you bought a modern Xbox in the last few years, you probably got this controller in the box, or some variation of it. This is basically just an iterative design of the Xbox One's controller from 2013. But if you're like me and you've been playing on Xbox for 23 years at this point, you'll know that there are 23 years of controller development from the original big fat controller to the smaller version to the Xbox 360 controller, my personal favorite, and of course the ones that we have today. But courtesy of Hyperkin, if you have one of those older controllers in your top favorite controllers lists, you can actually now relive that experience on a modern Xbox thanks to their Duke, their DutchesS, and their Xenon controllers. And I have all three of them, and so today I want to compare each of them to their original counterparts and see how close they are, see if the feel is the same, and just generally tell you what the benefits are. So let's dive in. Now for these comparisons, I'm going to be going in chronological order just because I figured it'd be easier that way. And so that means that the first comparison we're going to do is the first one that I bought and the first one Hyperkin made, the Duke. And it is the biggest controller that I have ever held in my hands. And that makes sense because the original Duke was also the biggest controller that I had ever held in my hands. Although I will say Hyperkin did use the space a little bit better with this one. It's got a couple tricks we'll talk about here in a minute, but in terms of size and feel, it is exactly the same as the Duke. In fact, here, let me show you. This is the original Xbox Duke controller. It is massive and it's pretty worn down and rattles a bit because this was my preferred controller back in the day. Yes, I was one of the weird people who liked using the Duke, and then this is Hyperkin's Duke. It is exactly the same in size. The actual layout is identical. In fact, they even replicated the staggered trigger configuration that you had on the original. Now, one thing to note is this is the older version of the Duke, so they have changed out the micro USB that powers this one for USB-C on the newer models. This is a wired controller, by the way. All of them will be wired, so for some of you that might be a deal breaker. I don't particularly mind it, but yeah, this is a wired controller. My version is micro USB, which I hate, but you do get modern USB-C on the newer versions. In terms of the overall feel, I played Halo CE with this just because that's what I used to play with this old Duke controller, and it feels pretty much the same. The joystick feel is almost identical. I will say this has a little more kind of drag to the joysticks, though I feel like that might just be age related because these feel pretty close and the old ones feel a little crunchy, so it's probably age related and not actually a difference in the analog sticks themselves. The D-pad is just awful, but it was also awful on the original. I don't understand how they thought that this melted black marshmallow shape or molar shape, whatever you want to call it, was a good idea for the D-pad, but they did, and it was awful then, and it's awful now. But to Hyperkin's credit, good or bad, they pretty much replicated everything. The only thing on the Hyperkin Duke that does feel and look different is the button set on the side here, your X, A, B, Y. And the reason for that is because these buttons are more traditionally what Hyperkin uses on their non-retro style controllers, where you have sort of a white insert inside of a clear plastic covering, and the buttons themselves are much clickier than the buttons on the Duke. And that's not just age on these. I know these do have a bit more sloppiness than they did when they were new, but they were never that clicky. Visually though, like I said, this has a white insert inside of clear plastic, and from everything I can tell with Microsoft's molding process, the actual clear covering for the white text on the inside is all molded as one, because when I take this apart, it is one button, and when I take this apart, it's two pieces. So kind of odd, and they actually carried over that really clicky button press to the white and black buttons. Kind of odd. Speaking of the black and white buttons, on the Duke controller and the S variant, which we'll talk about here in a bit, you had black and white buttons, but no bumpers. The bumpers didn't show up until the Xbox 360, so of course, you have the black and white buttons on the Duke remake. However, because this is a modern controller, you do have bumpers that are probably in the most unergonomic spot I have ever seen. They are so high up on the controller, it's not even funny. But the good thing is, they are literally just remaps of the black and white buttons. So you can press black and white, and whatever game you map to the bumpers, you can just have the bumpers be here. It's still not great in terms of ergonomics, and I can't believe I used to play this as my main controller back in the day, but yeah, it's an option, and I will probably never use the bumpers on this. In fact, I can probably count on one hand how many times I pressed the buttons up here on the bumpers. Most of them are during this video right now. But speaking of buttons, the very last thing that is sort of the party piece for this Duke controller is the fact that the center jewel, which was originally just a big plastic jewel with an Xbox piece of paper inside, is a screen. Now, it's not a screen that does much. In fact, it does one thing, but this thing is so massive, and they were able to shrink the technology in this from this so much that they could fit a screen inside. And the screen plays the original boot up animation for the first Xbox. That is so cool. And yes, it is a functional button as well. When you press it, it brings up the home menu on the Xbox. But the fact that technology has gotten so small and this thing was so massive for its time that they could fit a screen into this button blows my mind. Now, there is some space savings on this, which is probably where they were able to get the extra space to put the screen. Mainly the fact that on the back of this, you have just a big flat piece of plastic, but on the original, you had a slot, actually 2 of them, for memory cards. Yes, sorry, you can't drag your original Xbox memory cards over to the Xbox One courtesy of the retro controllers, but that's a pipe dream anyway. Though I do have an Xbox memory card transfer kit still in its box that I'm going to unbox at some point later this month. So maybe subscribe for that, and if you like this video so far, maybe give it a like. Anyway, future plans aside, this thing is really cool, but it is definitely a novelty piece. I have this one, and I have the transparent green version, but I don't really use them for anything other than playing Halo CE or some backwards compatible original Xbox games, which I love the fact you can do that on the Xboxes, the modern ones, because being able to just pop an original Xbox disc into my modern Xbox and play it with this, talk about nostalgia. I freaking love it. But the other time I use this is when I'm handing it to somebody and I want them to experience how I experienced something like Halo, but I'm doing it on my modern Xbox with the Master Chief Collection because I don't want to put more mileage on my original console and potentially kill it faster. Point is, this thing is really cool, but I don't recommend it as a main controller unless you're a psychopath, in which case, please seek help. As of late, the only versions of these that I've been able to find on Hyperkin's website have been the special editions, going for 90 bucks. So that's a bit of a hard sell, especially considering you're going to buy this and probably not use it a whole lot. So I don't really recommend this one for a daily driver, and it is also now harder to recommend these since you can't really just get a regular one. It has to be limited edition. So that moves us on to the next version that Hyperkin made. If I remember this correctly, Microsoft basically redesigned the Duke controller into the smaller S variant a couple years into the production of the Xbox because in order to sell in Asian markets, they needed to be able to sell it with a smaller controller. And so the S variant was born, and so Hyperkin made the DutchesS with a capital S. Now, because this is one that I picked up recently, I was able to actually film the unboxing of this and the Xenon, and the box is so cool. I love the fact that they actually embossed the name of the controller into the cardboard on the inside. It does also come with a really nice braided cable. Again, all of them are corded, but I love the fact that it's a braided USB-C cable because I can use it for other things to charge it. It is USB-A instead of C to C, but in this case that makes sense because you don't have a USB-C port on actually any of the Xboxes. Even the modern Xbox Series S and X don't have C to C, it's A to C. Weird. But anyway, this thing is so cool, and it actually packs in quite a few modern touches along with just being a really nice replica of the original controller. So like I did before, this is the original S controller that came with the Xboxes after the Duke was no longer a thing, and this is the Hyperkin remake, the DutchesS. And there are some things that are very different, of course, the biggest one being the space savings, where you don't have to deal with memory cards on the back or a cord built right in. It actually just has a little port for USB-C. But otherwise, it looks pretty similar, though there are some key differences that I noticed just being OCD like I am. One of the biggest differences I noticed is actually going to be pretty hard to show on camera, so I'm going to do my best, but there is a slightly off green color to the black version of these S controllers. And it isn't just the one that I have here. I have 3 black controllers that were this variant, and they all have sort of a greenish tint to them. And I don't think it's age because the cord itself also has a bit of a green tint to it. So I think Xbox, in one way or another, tried to get a little bit of a green finish in the black, and you just don't get that on this Hyperkin remake. It is just black plastic, and that's fine because, again, at a glance they look identical, but I'm going to do my best to make it show up on camera. But yeah, that is just something I noticed. Another difference I noticed that really isn't a big deal, but it's just something I noticed because OCD, is the fact that this little circle inside of the buttons here is indented, whereas on the Hyperkin controller, it's actually just the same curvature as the rest of the controller. Not a big deal, but I figured this may have been made from the original molds of the Xbox controllers, but it doesn't seem to be. And another thing that I thought was wrong, but was actually just fine, was the button sizes. I thought the buttons on this were too small, but in reality, the original version of this controller had the smaller buttons and maybe actually had the curved button circle thing in the middle, but I don't know about that. I just know that the original buttons were smaller and then a couple later variants had the bigger buttons instead. So not actually inaccurate when it comes to the button size, though if you hold up these two together, it does look like they are different because, well, this is a later version. But enough rambling about the little details. This thing overall feels great in the hand. I don't know why when I was a kid I always wanted to main the Duke controller, because this thing is still comfortable to this day. Yeah, it's a little on the bigger side, and the bumpers that they added to it, just like they did on the Duke, are a little difficult to reach, but not nearly as difficult to reach as the Duke, so that's an improvement. But honestly, it does still have a pretty modern feel despite its very aged design. The bumpers, of course, are still mapped to your black and white buttons. The buttons themselves, X, A, B, Y, and the bumpers, or the black and white buttons, are still much clickier than the ones you got on the original Xbox controllers, but again, that's probably just because it's Hyperkin and they're using their button technology and their button designs, which again also have two pieces for the clear and the white when it comes to the XABY layout, whereas again, Microsoft made it all in one mold. Small details, but nothing major. Alongside the buttons, you also get pretty much the exact same trigger feel as you got with the original Xbox controller, which is good because I love the feel of these triggers. They're kind of tucked away underneath of the body of the controller, so I just love the way those feel. You also still have, of course, start and select, and you have two extra buttons. You have the share button, and the little jewel in the middle that used to just be a sticker is now actually a button to do the home menu functions, just like you had on the Duke. In terms of improvements, there are two big improvements on this. One of them just kind of comes naturally with the newer controller design, which is the D-pad. It is a bit clickier, which when it comes to D-pads is good, and thank God it's not the molar design or melted marshmallow design. But when it comes to the joysticks, this is a huge improvement, and Hyperkin knows it. The joysticks on this controller are Hall effects joysticks. So you have a very similar overall movement feel in terms of how it feels to move the joysticks, but when it comes to how they actually interact in game, it is better than any joysticks that I have used that weren't Hall effects. Like, the improvements mean that when I go and play on the original Xbox with these little joysticks, it is a night and day difference. This, you can feel the dead zones, and that partly comes with age, but also just comes with the fact that this was old technology. These have no dead zones. It is really awesome. It's kind of bizarre to go and move your character in Halo and watch them just instantly move the moment the joystick is touched. It is so nice. It is the biggest improvement they could have done to this thing, and I'm so glad they did it. Now, I mean, for 50 USD, I would hope they would improve something like that, and it's definitely worth it. I love the feeling of a modern controller with modern hardware like Hall effects joysticks in a design that I love. Again, kind of feel like I missed out on this controller design a little bit because the only time I used it was if I didn't bring my Duke controller with me to a LAN party. Yes, I am that old. And so I didn't use these as much as I used the Duke. So being able to go back and play some of the old Halo games through the Master Chief Collection, or again, backwards compatible games on the Xbox with this controller now, I feel like I'm not only getting the experience I missed, but I'm getting an improved version of it because of these Hall effects joysticks. It's so nice. Now, I did forget to mention something on the Duke that's also on this and the next controller is the headphone jack. This has a headphone jack for any headset if you want to play a game without hearing it through the TV and just through the headphones, or if you want to talk smack to people and try not to get banned off of Xbox Live, you can plug in a headset here and it runs straight to the console. And in my opinion, it sounds a little bit better. I ran this by a couple friends when I was using this and they said it did sound a little better. I'm guessing because it's a wired controller and not having to compress the audio over wireless. But maybe that's just me, but again, I ran it through some friends. Doesn't matter, you have a headphone jack, which is more than you can say for most smartphones nowadays, so there you go. But moving on from this controller, there is one other controller that Hyperkin makes for the same price, but in my opinion is my favorite controller design of all time, and that is the Xenon. Yes, I said it and I stand by it. This is my favorite controller design. It just feels like it was made for human hands. And without the battery bump on the back, this is pretty much perfect. I love the feel. It's just the right weight. Like, don't get me wrong, I like the Xbox One controller design, but it just feels a bit too thick. It just doesn't quite feel as slim as this thing. The triggers are nice and wide on the Xbox One, but there's something nice about having these fine little skinny triggers, and the bumpers are so comfortable in terms of their placement, and they're not too big. I could go on and on about why this is my favorite controller design, but instead, let's go ahead and compare it to the original. So aside from the color differences, which on these is pretty much just because of age, because these things were made white and they showed every bit of dirt, aside from that, these are pretty damn close. And again, the button design is going to be different. You have the single mold of the Xbox and you have the kind of two-piece buttons of Hyperkin. Whatever. However, Hyperkin did get the Xbox logo in the jewel, which if you've ever bought one of those rip-off 360 controllers that's made cheap for GameStop, they don't have the Xbox X in the middle. This does. Now, they opted for the chrome finish, which you would really only get on something like the Elite Xbox controller, whereas the white controllers originally had this sort of brushed metal look to them. And one of my least favorite things about this replica, and I know they couldn't do it because it's just not something built into the function of the Xbox One, is the lack of the player number ring. But you got to make concessions where you can. It does kind of bum me out because I think Microsoft made the coolest boot up animation and the coolest player number indicator system of any console by building it into the little ring around the console's power button and building it around the actual Xbox jewel on the controller, but that's not a function of the Xbox One, so you just get the button and a little white light telling you that it's on. And black buttons, for some reason, I don't know exactly why they did that apart from maybe it's a part spin thing. You have black buttons for the select and start and then a share button, which is a new button. But overall, I could nitpick this thing to death, but I just love it too much. And I'm, yes, letting my personal feelings get in the way, going a little off script here. I would pick this any day of the week, even though technically, and I say technically like electronics and specifications wise, the DutchesS is better. I still love this thing more. Like, I've put an embarrassing number of hours into Halo 3 just testing this controller. And I tested this controller last because I knew my biases would get in the way, but God, I love this thing. It takes me back to when I first got my Xbox 360. It takes me back to the days where I would sit for hours in front of my RCA ColorTrax CRT television that my parents put in the basement, and I would play on Forge with Halo 3 or Halo Reach with my friends. Some friends who I still speak to this day. It's just such a beautiful set of memories for me. And so picking this thing up, yeah, I could nitpick it about little things that aren't quite accurate, but I love this thing. To get back on script here, like I said, the buttons are made differently, but everything else feels almost identical. The bumpers are pretty much the same, albeit not as worn out as these. The triggers, as I said, are skinny, but just the exact same feel, even to the amount that they come down, where they don't always seat completely inside the body of the controller, which is a weird decision, but it was replicated perfectly on these. The joysticks feel just exactly the same. Honestly, the joysticks, or the caps for the joysticks rather, feel a bit more robust, which is good because, as you can tell from this one, the rubber that Microsoft used didn't really age particularly well. The D-pad is also made of a slightly different material from what I can tell. It's a matte finish instead of a glossy finish, but honestly that doesn't bother me too much either because it's just as clicky as the DutchesS and a noticeable improvement over what we had on the 360 controller. To get back to the joysticks for a second though, I mentioned that the DutchesS is technically a better controller, and when I say technically I mean in terms of specifications, because this is the second of the replica controllers that Hyperkin made. The order they made these replicas was the Duke, the Xenon, and then the DutchesS. And so the DutchesS, being the most recent one, has the Hall effects joysticks I mentioned, and this doesn't. And that's a bit of a bitter pill to swallow, considering this is the same $50 price as the DutchesS. Again, for me, I can swallow that pill because I will, in this instance, let myself be blinded by nostalgia. I love this controller so much. It is my favorite of the lineup. It brings back so many good memories. It feels perfect in the hand, but if I had to pick in terms of technical improvements only, the DutchesS would be the one to go with. So to wrap up this overly long video about game controllers, the Duke is pretty much just a showpiece. It is really cool to look at, it is really fun to play with, even though it is a bit of a hassle to play with. It's cool that it's got the display, and it is just a wave of nostalgia made super, super well. And if you get a modern one, it is expensive at $90, but you do get the modern benefit of a USB-C cable, and of course you have that kind of gimmicky but really cool display in the jewel that plays the boot up animation for the Xbox. When it comes to the DutchesS, that's the first of these 3 replica controllers that I would consider a potential daily driver, mainly because it still has that nostalgic feel of the S controller, but you have Hall effects joysticks, you still have a great trigger feel. The D-pad, God, the D-pad is just improved because the one on the Duke is so terrible. Yeah, you don't have a screen, but it's a smaller controller, it fits better in the hands. The bumpers are a bit awkward to get to, but not impossible, and overall it just has a really nice feel. And again, those Hall effects controller joysticks, man, those things are so good. It's a better experience than what I had with the original Xbox controller, so that is something that is definitely worth considering. And then, of course, the Xenon controller, the one that I am most nostalgic for, but looking at objectively is still not as good as the DutchesS. This thing has the best feel in the hand. It has the best access to the bumpers and the triggers. The buttons are perfectly placed, just like the 360s were. You don't have the Hall effects joysticks, and that is a big letdown. Still a controller that is worth considering for daily driving, but again, technically, the DutchesS is better. The D-pad, definitely an improvement. Still about the same as what you get on the DutchesS controller, but a bit more of a matte finish. In fact, matte versus gloss, though I remember the original 360 having a gloss one, but whatever. And of course, with that $50 price tag, if you're looking for the technically better one, the DutchesS is better for 50 bucks, but if you like the feel in the hand and the overall just playability of the 360 or the nostalgia of the 360 controller, the Xenon controller, still 50 bucks, so spend your money where you feel it is best spent. But either way, that's been it. This has been a blast to make. I not only got to play my original Xbox controllers on the original Xboxes, but then I got to compare them to modern replicas. It was so much fun. I'm so glad to be back. These next few videos are going to be very Xbox themed, just not for any particular reason. I've just had a lot of Xbox things come through recently. And so, yeah, make sure to subscribe for that. If you like this video, definitely give it a like. To give you a little bit of a hint of what's coming up next, I'm talking about Halo moving to Unreal Engine. I am unboxing a Xenon Xbox 360, still in its box, and I'm going to be playing around with that weird memory card transfer kit. That'll be interesting. Also, I'm going to be talking about what it's like to buy an Xbox One S in 2024, considering it is still a modern console, technically. So either way, a lot of stuff coming up. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all in the next video. Make sure to be there, and have a good one.